There exists a language that has defeated every attempt at clean classification. It carries the sound of English without being English. It echoes West African speech patterns without matching any single one of them precisely. Academic linguists devoted more than a century to positioning it within known frameworks and kept reaching the same unsatisfying destination. It simply does not belong to any established category, and that was only the language. Along a thin coastal corridor stretching from the southern edge of South Carolina through Georgia and into the northern reaches of Florida, there is a world that the American mainland largely passed over. Sea islands, tidal marshes, landscapes defined by water and isolation, places that time approached cautiously and rarely entered fully. The community that has called this corridor home for more than 3 centuries is the Gullah Geechee people. Through those 300 years, they maintained what most communities in comparable circumstances did not: their relationship to food, their ceremonial and spiritual life, their music, their language. For generations, the academic explanation for this was considered settled and sufficient. Enslaved Africans, physically separated from the broader American social world on remote coastal plantations, had managed to hold on to pieces of the cultures from which they had been violently removed. Geographically cut off, they preserved what they carried. The explanation was logical, it was respectful, it honored the resilience it described. It was also not the complete story. When genetic researchers began conducting ancestry analyses on Gullah Geechee communities in the late 2000s and through the following decade, they arrived with a clear set of expectations. They anticipated finding African ancestry consistent with what appears across most African American populations: predominantly West and Central African origin, modest European admixture from the plantation era, and perhaps faint indigenous American traces. The data confirmed some of that, not all of it. Signals appeared in the genetic record that the standard transatlantic slave trade narrative did not adequately explain. Specific haplogroup distributions, African ancestry clustering patterns that pointed not toward West Africa in general, but toward extraordinarily narrow sub-regional corridors within it. Corridors that the surviving historical shipping records did not fully account for. The genetic data was posing a question that the historical record had not thought to formulate. To grasp why this matters, you first need to understand what distinguishes the Gullah Geechee before the genetics ever enters the picture. Most African American populations experienced profound and systematic cultural destruction over the generations of American slavery. Forced movement between plantations, deliberate separation of families and linguistic communities, suppression of African languages, confiscation of names, severing of genealogical memory. These were not incidental features of the institution. They were operational policy. The goal was to unmake people, to strip them of the internal resources that collectivity and shared identity provide, and to produce isolated, disoriented individuals who could not effectively resist or organize. And yet the Gullah Geechee retained, at a scale unmatched by virtually any other enslaved population in North America, something that this policy was specifically designed to eliminate: a living Creole language with active daily use, a coherent spiritual system carrying unmistakable structural roots in specific African traditions, a body of ecological and agricultural knowledge bearing the clear signature of particular African knowledge systems, a relationship to land, water, and community that operated according to principles that were not invented in South Carolina. How did this happen? The first and most commonly offered explanation is geographic isolation. The sea islands were not easy places to reach or to live. Malaria was not merely present, it was relentless. European planters and their overseers minimized their time on the islands whenever possible, transferring day-to-day supervisory authority to enslaved black drivers and managers. This created, effectively by default, operational spaces within which African cultural life was not under constant surveillance and suppression. The argument is that isolation functioned as a kind of accidental shelter. This is almost certainly part of the truth. But isolation accounts for preservation. It does not account for specificity. When the spiritual practices of the Gullah Geechee are examined carefully, what researchers find is not a diffuse, generalized West African influence. They find specific structural elements traceable to Yoruba, Mende and Congo traditions. Not a blurred composite, but identifiable frameworks that point back to particular cultural origins. When the agricultural and food traditions are analyzed, the crops cultivated, the preparation techniques, the ecological knowledge embedded in tidal rice farming, they point toward a specific agricultural zone in West Africa, not toward the continent broadly. When linguists map the grammatical architecture of Gullah Creole, they find systematic structural parallels to Sierra Leonean Creole that are too consistent and too precise to be explained by independent development or by coincidence. This is not cultural memory in the vague atmospheric sense. This is cultural memory with a specific return address. Which brings us to the second theory, the one that historians have built the most substantial evidentiary case around, the Rice Coast hypothesis. In the opening decades of the 18th century, South Carolina planters confronted a practical problem that their own knowledge base could not solve. They were attempting to establish rice cultivation on the Sea Islands, and they did not know how to do it. This requires context. Rice cultivation is not a simple agricultural practice. Growing African rice, Oryza glaberrima, the variety being cultivated in a coastal tidal environment, requires a precise and sophisticated body of knowledge. Understanding of tidal flooding cycles and how to use them. Knowledge of soil preparation specific to low-lying coastal marshland. Ability to read and manage the ecology of a landscape that is partly land and partly water in a way that changes with the season, the tide, and the rainfall. No European farming tradition had developed this knowledge. It belonged to the peoples of the rice coast of West Africa, the region corresponding to what is today Sierra Leone, Guinea, and Senegal, where generations of communities had been cultivating coastal tidal rice ecosystems for centuries before any European ship appeared on their shores. Planters in Charleston began specifically seeking out enslaved people from this coastal West African region. In some documented cases, they paid premiums above standard slave market prices to acquire individuals from the rice coast. The reasoning was explicitly practical. These people carried knowledge that no European possessed and that could not be learned quickly from a book or from observation. This was not compassion or cultural appreciation. It was the extraction of expertise under conditions of absolute brutality. But it produced a consequence that those planters did not anticipate and would not have desired had they understood it clearly. By deliberately concentrating people from a specific, geographically narrow region of West Africa onto the Sea Islands, the planters inadvertently assembled something that the standard mechanics of the slave trade were specifically designed to prevent. A community of people who shared language families, who shared spiritual frameworks, who shared an ecological worldview and a body of agricultural knowledge. Not a deliberately fragmented mixture of Africans from dozens of unrelated ethnic groups, which was the normal slave trade practice intended precisely to break solidarity, but something far closer to a coherent cultural transplant. Historian Daniel Littlefield documented this pattern extensively in his foundational work on rice and slavery in colonial South Carolina. The historical shipping records, fragmentary and imperfect as they are, support the pattern. The demand for rice coast expertise was real, sustained, and documented across multiple decades of the early colonial period. And yet even this well-evidenced explanation does not fully account for everything the genetics have begun to reveal. Because here is where the data crosses into territory that is genuinely surprising. A 2016 study published in the American Journal of Human Genetics, followed by subsequent research conducted through the Family Tree DNA African Ancestry project, mapped haplogroup distributions across African American populations with a level of geographic resolution that had not previously been achievable. When Gullah Geechee communities were analyzed as a distinct population group, the results produced a statistical profile that separated them clearly from African American populations in the interior South. Gullah Geechee individuals showed elevated frequencies of both mitochondrial and Y chromosome haplogroups that are today geographically concentrated in specific subregions of Sierra Leone and the Senegambia. This was consistent with the Rice Coast narrative, but it went further. Within those African ancestry lineages, the genetic clustering was unusually tight. In plain language, what this means is the following. Many Gullah Geechee individuals share common ancestors not merely at the level of a broad regional African population, but at the level of specific, identifiable communities within West Africa. The genetic diversity that researchers would expect to find if this population had been assembled through the standard slave trade, drawing from dozens of different ethnic groups deliberately mixed across multiple regions, was significantly compressed in Gullah Geechee communities compared to other African American populations. This points towards something more targeted, more concentrated, more coherent than even the Rice Coast hypothesis fully accounts for on its own. Consider what this looks like from the other side of the Atlantic. Imagine a village on the coast of what is today Sierra Leone in the year 1720. You are Menda. Your community has cultivated this particular stretch of coastal landscape across many generations. You carry knowledge about how water moves through a rice field during the rainy season. You know which plants indicate soil conditions that support a good harvest. You know the names of the spirits connected to the land you work, and you know the rituals that maintain the relationship between your community and the ecological world it depends upon. And then, across a span of months, a significant portion of your community disappears, not dispersed randomly across an ocean to be separated from each other and mixed with strangers. Transported together or in closely related groups to a landscape in South Carolina that resembles, in ways that must have been deeply disorienting, the one you left behind. The same tidal creeks, the same low coastal marshes, the same flat horizon meeting the water. A landscape that your specific knowledge was built for. Your expertise was the reason you were taken. It was also, paradoxically, the reason you were kept together. The knowledge functioned as a group asset. Dispersing the group would have destroyed the knowledge, and the knowledge was too economically valuable to destroy. This is not conjecture. The operational autonomy of Gullah Geechee communities within the plantation system is documented across the historical record. These communities ran the rice operations. They directed the agricultural work. They brought new arrivals into the knowledge system. They maintained the social infrastructure necessary to transmit that knowledge from one generation to the next. And in doing so, they maintained precisely the kinds of social structures and cultural transmission pathways that were eliminated everywhere else the slave system operated at full intensity. The isolation did not preserve the culture alone. The culture preserved itself because the culture was too economically valuable to its captors to be destroyed. This is the reversal that restructures the entire story. The Gullah Geechee were not passive beneficiaries of geographic luck. They were not simply fortunate to have been left alone on forgotten islands where their traditions happened to survive. In a historical irony whose darkness is matched only by its precision, the very specific knowledge that made them targets for capture became the mechanism through which their cultural continuity was protected. Their captors required them to remain Menda, required them to know the rice, required them to communicate with one another, to organize the work, to teach what they knew to the next generation. In engineering the conditions for maximum economic extraction, the plantation system inadvertently engineered the conditions for one of the most extraordinary acts of cultural self-preservation in the recorded history of the Atlantic world. The genetic data is now providing biological confirmation for what cultural anthropologists had been building toward through decades of fieldwork. This was not a diaspora community that happened by chance to preserve fragments of a distant origin. This was a coherent population drawn from a geographically and ethnically narrow source that reconstructed functional cultural continuity in a new landscape because the social and ecological conditions, however horrific the forces that created them, made that reconstruction not merely possible but structurally necessary. There is a moment that researchers and cultural workers at the Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor, the federal designation that now provides official recognition and some measure of protection to this community, describe when they bring genetic ancestry results back to community members. It is not surprise they encounter in those conversations, it is recognition. One elder woman on St. Helena Island in South Carolina, upon being shown a genetic ancestry result, indicating a primary lineage cluster in the Sierra Leone Guinea coastal region, is reported to have responded with quiet certainty. That's where the rice knowledge comes from. We always knew that. 300 years of separation, 300 years of deliberate severing. and science arrived, finally, at a place the community had never entirely left. There is still an enormous amount that the genetics cannot tell us. The specific villages, the specific families, the exact routes by which particular haplogroups traveled from particular coastal West African communities to particular sea islands off the coast of South Carolina. The documentary record is incomplete, and it is incomplete in a specific and meaningful way. It is incomplete because the system that organized this forced migration had no operational interest in preserving the human particularity of the people it moved. Names were not recorded because names were not considered to matter. Origins were not systematically documented because origins were not considered relevant. But DNA is a form of documentation that operates entirely outside the control of the people who would have preferred certain information not be preserved. It passed through every generation, through every deliberate attempt to sever, separate, and erase. It traveled through centuries in the bodies of people who were told, in every available language, that where they came from did not matter, and that who they were before the crossing did not exist anymore. And what it carries, in its sequences and its haplogroup patterns and its clustering distributions, is a geography, a homeland, a specificity that no degree of historical violence could fully remove from the biological record. What the data is telling us now is that the Gullah Geechee story is not simply a story of survival in the ordinary sense. It is a story about the structural limits of erasure, about the ways that knowledge, agricultural knowledge, linguistic knowledge, spiritual knowledge, genetic knowledge, travels through time in forms that are more durable than the systems built to suppress them, about the difference between destroying a community and destroying the evidence that the community existed. The question this opens up is larger than one community on one stretch of coastline. If the Gullah Geechee retained this much, with this level of specificity, with this degree of coherence, what does that suggest about other communities in the African diaspora whose cultural continuities are less visible, less celebrated, less thoroughly documented? What bodies of knowledge are embedded in foodways and musical structures and spiritual practices and ways of relating to land that the analytical tools of the 20th century were not equipped to trace? The genetic tools being developed now are beginning to function as that kind of instrument. Slowly, imperfectly, constrained by the gaps in the reference data and by the deliberate destruction of the records that would complete the picture. But with a growing precision that is producing histories that could not be written before, and that are quietly replacing histories that were written the first time by institutions and individuals with every reason to leave certain things out. The Gullah Geechee were never adequately described by the accounts that most textbooks offered. They were never simply an isolated remnant, preserved by geographic accident on islands the modern world walked past without looking. They were, and they remain, a living archive of a specific place on the coast of West Africa, a living archive of specific people whose names the records did not preserve, but whose genetic signatures survived 3 centuries of everything designed to erase them. A living archive of a form of knowledge, about water, about rice, about land, about community, about the practices that hold a people together when every external force is working to pull them apart, that crossed an ocean under conditions designed to make such crossings impossible. The DNA data is still being analyzed, the reference panels are still being refined. The connections between specific Gullah Geechee lineages and specific West African communities are still being mapped with the precision this community deserves. But one thing the data has already established beyond reasonable dispute is this: the archive is real, the specificity is real, the depth of what was carried and preserved across 3 centuries of deliberate destruction is real, and we are only beginning to understand how far down it goes. The Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor today stretches across a 12,000 square mile area encompassing parts of North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. It is the first African-American heritage corridor recognized at the federal level in the United States. The designation acknowledges something the genetic data is now putting into biological terms, that what exists in this corridor is not simply a regional curiosity or a historical footnote. It is one of the most intact and traceable direct cultural connections to a specific African homeland that exists anywhere in the Western Hemisphere. The language, Gullah Creole, is still spoken, not as a relic preserved in museums, as a living first language for some community members, as a second language and cultural touchstone for thousands more. Linguists who have spent careers studying it describe it not as a degraded or simplified version of English, but as a fully realized linguistic system with its own internal logic, its own grammatical architecture, its own expressive range. The food traditions, built around rice, around the particular coastal ingredients of the sea island landscape, around preparation methods that carry the structural fingerprints of specific West African culinary practice, are still alive. They appear not only in home kitchens and community celebrations, but in a growing body of culinary scholarship that is repositioning Gullah Geechee food as one of the foundational architectures of what eventually became Southern American cuisine more broadly. The spiritual practices, incorporating elements of Yoruba, Mende, and Congo traditions that syncretized over generations into a distinctly Gullah Geechee ceremonial life, are still observed in forms that cultural anthropologists describe as among the most structurally coherent, African-derived spiritual systems surviving anywhere in North America. Each of these, the language, the food, the spiritual life, represents a thread that runs from the present moment backward across 3 centuries of Atlantic history and arrives, as the DNA is now confirming, at a specific stretch of West African coastline. Not at Africa in general. At a place. This distinction is the one that matters most. The difference between descended from enslaved Africans and descended from specific communities in what is today Sierra Leone and Senegal, from specific knowledge traditions developed in specific coastal landscapes, is not merely a genetic detail. It is the difference between a history defined by what was taken and a history that includes, alongside what was taken, what was carried, what was protected, what was passed forward in full knowledge of what it represented, through generations of people who understood, even when the broader world did not, exactly who they were and exactly where they came from. The science is catching up to what the community already knew. That is the story the data is telling, and it is only beginning.